A recent paper from the Watson Institute of Brown University found that the genocide in Gaza has, since October 7th, killed more journalists than the US Civil War, World War One and Two, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, including the conflicts in Cambodia and Laos, the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s and 2000s, and the post 9/11 war in Afghanistan combined.
Mm.
Can you help us unpack what has been happening and what this means for journalism as a whole?
I mean, when you put it like that, it is just absolutely astonishing, the hundreds of journalists that they've killed in Gaza. And I think what that is a sign of is that it shows you that it is a genocide, that it's a Holocaust. Some people say that it's too provocative to describe it as a Holocaust, but to me, in my view, that is literally what we're seeing. Like the word Holocaust for a mass killing predates even the word genocide, and it predates the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews during World War II. And the literal meaning is of a kind of burning, a mass burning, and that is literally what we're seeing in Gaza, that they're targeting these civilian tents in the so-called safe areas and just burning civilians en masse in these tents. It's a mass genocide. So, like, the targeting, it's not only the targeting of journalists. What the sign of the systemic targeting of journalists shows that it is a genocide, that it is deliberately targeted at the civilian population and not Hamas. Like, yeah, they are targeting Hamas as well, but like the primary target is the people. Hamas just happens to be trying to fight that, physically fight that. The target, they say it openly, they want the removal of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Quite early on in the genocide, there was even an Israeli army officer who went on CNN, went on American television and said that he said it explicitly. He said the target is not Hamas, the target is all the civilians. He said it, that was his words in English. I believe it was October the 9th, 2023, the Israeli so-called defense minister, Yoav Gallant. He's now the former defense minister, but at the time, what he said on October the 9th was, "We're fighting human animals. There's going to be no more food, water, fuel, anything. When we're fighting human animals." And he didn't say Hamas are the human animals. He didn't say Palestinian terrorists are the human animals. He was talking about the whole of the Gaza Strip. He was talking about all Palestinians in Gaza. And so the fact that so many journalists have been killed shows that what they're saying is true to the reality of what they're actually doing, which is to systematically destroy and murder as much as possible. The population in general. I know that it's not about the fighters. It's not about the so-called terrorists per se. It's about the population. It's about removing and killing the non-Jewish population because Zionism is an ethno-religious racist ideology. It's the ideology of what many groups have called Jewish supremacy because it's a kind of racial ideology. It's a settler colonial ideology. It's not unique to, in many ways, to settler colonial ideologies because that's what they do. I mean, look at North America where they wiped out the indigenous population there as well. I suppose that one of the main differences is that it came later, it started in the late 19th century in Palestine. So, you know, it is a sign of that. I mean, you compare it as well to the special military operation, the Russian, invasion of Ukraine. Russia's military power could have done far more. They could have wiped out the civilian population in Ukraine as well. But the ideology was different. They wanted a country and a people to be intact because most of the Ukrainian people in the southeast of Ukraine consider themselves to be Russians. And so, they wanted to have a country intact. Whereas the Israelis don't want the Palestinians to be there. That's the bottom line. And they don't want them to exist, essentially. And so that's what they're carrying out. And they're using this kind of cover of, well, we're targeting terrorists. But There's many times where they don't even bother with that cover. And so the eradication of Palestinian journalists is one symptom of that, because they were also trying to eradicate Palestinian doctors. They're trying to eradicate the next generation of Palestinians. They're targeting health. My colleague at the Electronic Intifada, Nora Barris Friedman, has done so many interviews with health workers in Gaza trying to survive under this genocide. And it's the same thing, they're going after all of the institutions and all of the infrastructure and all of the human resources that make up a society and that contribute towards the survival of society. And so journalists are a big part of that, because of course they've also stopped Western journalists from entering the Gaza Strip entirely stopped them, with one or two exceptions, as long as they were embedded with Israeli military forces. But even that didn't seem to last very long. And they are deliberately targeting Palestinian journalists. And they've done it before, even before this genocide started. In the West Bank as well, Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in 2022 in Jenin. She was shot dead deliberately by an Israeli army sniper. It was reconstructed by experts, and they figured out where the shooting was coming from. The soldier shooting her, this Palestinian journalist, who incidentally also had American citizenship, Shireen Abu Akleh, he would have been able to see who she was, see her press vest. So it was a very deliberate, targeted assassination of somebody who was kind of, I mean, she was very famous in the Arab world, like as an Al Jazeera correspondent in the West Bank. She was a Palestinian herself, and the level of her fame within the Arab world, you'd have to compare her to someone, I don't know, someone like K80 or someone like that, who would be a household name across the whole region, essentially. And they deliberately did it, they deliberately did it. And then they made up all these lies afterwards. And they've never been held to account for that. And so of course, they're going to carry on doing that. And the Palestinian journalists in Gaza, especially, are paying for that lack of accountability with their lives. It's very depressing situation. We've got so many colleagues who have had to flee. We've got colleagues who have been in Gaza, have been killed. So this is the reality of genocide.
I mean, the attack that you've just outlined on Palestinian genocide in this period has been the most extreme, a really central element of this genocide. But there's also been just a worldwide attack on journalism throughout this whole period as well. And you have found yourself in the crosshairs of that yourself, as well as other colleagues at Electronic Intifada, including your editor. So I
Mm.
was just wondering if you could talk us through what has happened and update us on your current circumstances as well.
Well, I'll explain what happened to Ali first. So my colleague Ali Abunimah, the executive director of Electronic Intifada, earlier this year, he was visiting Switzerland, and he was invited there by Palestine solidarity groups who organized a speaking event for him. And he was then effectively kidnapped off the streets by ununiformed plainclothes people who turned out to be immigration police, I believe, of the Zurich canton of Switzerland. And then what happened? He was held without charge for 3 days and then released and immediately deported from Switzerland. It was strange because they said that, he'd violated, they seemed to be saying anyway, because there was no charges, but they seemed to be saying that he was banned from the country, but what they let him in legally. So what had actually happened was they banned him from the country after his entry, after there was a kind of hit job against him in the German language Swiss press. Anyway, that's essentially what happened. Luckily he was out after 3 days, and he is kind of fighting that. He's fighting that at the moment. I don't think I can say much more about that at the moment, but that, there will be more to say about it in the future. But it was quite explicitly done over his political views. It was over his views and over his reporting. That's what it's about. And in the Swiss press, when he was sort of defamed, that was essentially confirmed. What happened to me was different because it happened here in Britain, in London, where I live and where I'm a citizen of, but it kind of has the same root in the sense that it was all about my journalism, it was all about my reporting, and all about the fact that I oppose what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians and what they are doing to the Palestinians. So what happened was it was the 17th of October last year, and the police came and raided my home at 10 to 6 in the morning, so it was still dark, and they banged on the door, ring the doorbell, and they shouted at police, let us in. So yeah, it was a raid, and what they did was they searched the whole house. They said at the end of about 3 hours, they took all my devices, they took all my computers and phones that I use for my journalism specifically, and they made it very clear that, it wasn't a case of mistaken identity, that they knew I was a journalist, and they asked me specifically which devices I use for my journalism, and they wanted that to be known. I mean, it seemed to me like a fishing expedition, right? Because obviously the ones I use for my journalism, I'm going to have my files on there, my notes, my contacts, all my details with all my sources. And so to me, this was very dangerous and really endangering to my sources, both here and in Palestine. And they did have a warrant. In my case, they had a warrant to search my home and my vehicle. And on that paperwork they handed me also had a covering letter, and that covering letter stated, "We're aware of your profession." So they were stating in writing that they know I'm a journalist, and that, under British law, I should have the right to, and in fact, the duty to protect my sources as a journalist. But they were fully aware of my profession, fully aware of the fact I'm a journalist. They took all my computers and phones, and they still hold them to this day. And I wasn't charged with anything. I wasn't even arrested, actually. I mean, I suppose I was effectively detained within my home for a few hours, but I wasn't arrested, and I wasn't charged with anything. What it said on the warrant was that they suspect that I may have violated one of Britain's anti-terror laws, or terror, they're actually called terror acts, terrorism acts, and may have been guilty of supporting a prescribed organization. But they haven't charged me with that yet. So we'll see. There's ongoing legal efforts, and my lawyers are trying to get my devices back and stop the police accessing them, searching them, and endangering my sources. So that's as much as I can say about that for now. I was aware of the possibility that it could happen, right? Because people that I've been reporting on, it's happened to them before me. I've been reporting on groups like Palestine Action, which take direct action against Israeli arms firms in this country. It just seemed like it was getting closer and closer, and that it would be possible that, it could happen to me too. But when then it actually did happen, it's very it has an impact on you, and I think that's part of the intended effect is to make this, because even now as I'm speaking, I'm sort of trying to watch what I say a little bit because I have to be careful about what I say. Yeah, so and I think it's meant to have that effect, that chilling effect, and it's meant to stop activists, and it's meant to stop journalists from reporting on this. The latest that's come out about this came out this week. There's been a report in The Guardian, and emails obtained by a Freedom of Information request from Palestine Action's lawyers, actually. And it was reported in The Guardian, and I posted on my Twitter X account one of the emails from September last year. So a month before I was raided, the Attorney General's office emailed the Deputy Israeli Ambassador following up from a meeting they'd had. Now, we don't know exactly what she said, this person from the Attorney General's office, but because most of the email is redacted, right? It's almost all redacted, actually. But crucially, they forgot to redact the subject line, and the subject line says contact details CPS SO15. So what that means is Crown Prosecution Service, which is obviously, the Britain's public prosecutions, the government prosecutions office, but it's still supposed to be, independent. And SO15 is the counter-terrorism command of the Metropolitan Police. So the so-called counter anti-terror squad, which raided my home and has raided the homes of other journalists and activists in Britain over the last year or so. So you have the Attorney General's office sending the contact details to the Israeli embassy of this counter-terror squad, which is then raiding activists and journalists who focus on Palestine, and that the Israeli government would definitely like to see in prison. So you see this kind of collusion between political but the Attorney General's office is meant to be, it is a political appointment, that they are then encouraging the Israelis to name people, it seems. What is the contents of that redacted email? We don't know yet, but it seems, the subtext there, it seems that they are encouraging the Israelis to say, yeah, you need to arrest this person, you need to arrest that person. And that's quite kind of similar to what's been happening in the US as well, with people being basically effectively kidnapped off the streets. Student campaigners quite often being effectively kidnapped off the streets by immigration police. And we see quite often that the names being put forward for this are from these pro-Israel groups, from these Israel lobby groups, or these, Zionist activist groups. That's publicly who the names are being put forward by. But what this email suggests, and what other facts that have come out in the US suggest, are that actually it's Israel itself that are putting forward these kinds of names. Because these pro-Israel groups anyway, many of them are often coordinated with the state of Israel itself. And the Israel lobby works very, very closely with the actual state of Israel itself. And so, we see the kind of collusion by a hostile foreign power